Welcome to day 6 of this course, where you are currently learning how to become a screenwriter in just 10 days. One exciting thing about today is that we actually get to start learning about the proper screenwriting format that we're going to be using for our screenplay. Day number 5, we created an outline. Then hopefully you also went the extra step and also separated your outline into those different scenes and gave each of them headings. If you have done this, then you can essentially grab all of those scenes and their headings, copy and paste it, and drag it straight into a screenwriting tool. And that brings me on to the first part of this video. Before we can start actually writing the script, we need to decide what tool we are actually going to use to write it. Now, look, you don't need to go out and buy any kind of expensive screenwriting software. If need be, you could just do it in Word. The formatting won't be quite right, but it's at least something, especially if you are on a budget and don't have a lot of money for extra subscriptions, etc. Worst case scenario, you could also do it all by hand and write it out manually in a notebook. I have done that in the past. That's kind of how I started out with screenplays. Since sort of starting to do it on a proper tool on a computer, it's kind of hard for me to go back and do that. That being said, the tool that I am going to be using is Final Draft. One of the things that I like about Final Draft is that you pretty much just buy it once and then you've got it, so it's not any kind of ongoing monthly subscription. You stack your subscriptions and then eventually you just have so many of them and they're just always around. So that's kind of why I like Final Draft. You pay for it once and you've just got it forever. One thing that I think we can probably do for this 10-day course is work with the trial. There is a link available where you can go to Final Draft and you can use this temporary trial run, which will allow you to follow along with exactly what I am doing in this video. If you have already used Final Draft in the past and you've already done this trial and it's already used up, easy fix. Just create another email or even just an email alias and then just start up another free trial with Final Draft. But then, of course, eventually, if you do have the funds available, it's probably a worthy investment because, again, you pay for it once and then it's done and it's off your head. Once you do have some kind of script writing tool available, we're going to get started with learning about the actual formatting of screenplays. You have actually already started learning about formatting in the previous video when we went through scene headings. But now we're just going to go into it a little bit more. What is the purpose of screenplay formatting? Why is it so specific? The screenplay formatting serves a few purposes. One of these is that it allows for a certain amount of empty space on the page, which makes it easier to read. Then, of course, there are certain elements in the script writing format that make it easier to clearly separate what is happening. So it separates dialogue from action, for example. So we clearly know which sections are people talking and which sections are the action, what people are doing, what people are physically doing in the space. By the end of this video, you will know the basics of how to do screenplay formatting, such as scene headings, action, and dialogue. Those are the main three, but there are also a lot of other elements, and I'll try to cover at least a few of those today. Screenplay formatting is something that you'll learn a little bit more as time goes on. You'll come up with very unique situations in your stories that will require a very unique solution. And some of the time it might require you coming up with a creative solution or finding something that someone else has used that has worked for them. Why should we be using some kind of screenwriting tool rather than just using something like Word? Firstly, using a screenwriting tool automatically places our script in the professional format. If you sent this off to a studio because you're looking for funding or something like that, then if you sent them a professionally formatted script, they're going to recognize it as being professional and they're going to take it a bit more serious. If you wrote something on a Word document and the spacing is kind of all over the place and it's clearly not programmed to look a certain way, then people are going to see that instantly and they are far less likely to actually consider it. It would have to be the most legendary screenplay ever for them to take that and decide to make it. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to take another look at scene headings. We've already done scene headings in the previous video. I'm just going to cover it again just in case. So the scene heading is pretty much just one line that very concisely explains when and where the scene is taking place. Firstly, you'll have int and ext. So int is interior and ext is exterior. So otherwise it means inside or outside. If your scene takes place inside of a lounge room or a living room, then it would be int, I-N-T. The next thing we're going to do is write down just a couple of words that explain where it is. For example, living room. This one would be int dot living room. Another thing to note for scene heading is that it is entirely capitalized. Everything is in capitals. So then the third thing that we're going to include is something that identifies the time of day. Int living room day, for example. With each of these different options, you can go into more detail if it is important. You can put day and you can put night. You can put sunrise or sunset. You can put 3 p.m. You can put lunchtime. You can put whatever. Be careful though, because whatever time of day that you're saying it is, only include it if it's actually an important detail, and also if it's something that the audience will clearly be able to see based on what's happening in the scene. So if you're saying it's 3 p.m., but then in the scene there's nothing saying that it's 3 p.m., you might as well just put day, because it doesn't matter. Also, there are other things as well. So if you're writing one scene and you say, living room day, and then you have another scene that follows directly on from that. So maybe people are having a conversation in the living room and then they walk into the kitchen. So the kitchen is technically a new scene, but you don't necessarily need to say day again. You would say continuous because it's coming directly from that previous scene. Or perhaps you're filming a scene and it's in the same location, but it's later in that day, in which case you would just put later. Next up is action lines. Action describes what is being seen or heard. So a couple of common mistakes that people will make when they are writing a screenplay is they will include stuff that is not seen or heard. For example, they might include a character's thoughts or a way a character is feeling. They'll say, Sally is sad. Sally was thinking about the time she was in high school and thinking about the time that she was afraid of her dad or something like that. But unless you can actually see or hear these things happening on screen, they shouldn't be included in the screenplay. So if you want to convey that Sally is sad, you wouldn't say Sally is sad. You would say, what signs is she giving off that is telling us that she is sad? Is she crying? Is she kind of like shrinking to, look small? Is she, what is she doing to tell us that she is sad? And you wouldn't say, she remembered that time that she was afraid of whatever, because we can't see that. We wouldn't know what she is afraid of, but you would have to sort of tell us, what is she doing that shows us that she's afraid? And then of course, if you did want us to connect it to whatever that memory is of the past, you would probably need to do something else. Maybe she's holding a photo that reminds her of, holding a photo from that time, or, maybe she's just had a conversation with someone about whatever has happened in the past. So then clearly we know that she is sad because of that. So just be careful. Don't include anything if it isn't seen or heard. So just picture what will be on screen at the cinema. And if it isn't on screen, if you can't see it and you can't hear it, it doesn't get included in the screenplay. Back to action lines. Action is all of the things that are happening. You are not writing what people are saying. You're not repeating anything that you've already said in the scene heading. You're giving additional details. We have the scene setting, which is interior, living room, day. We can start off sort of explaining a few details about the living room, and then somebody walks into the living room. You would type all of these things in there. We are seeing all these things that are happening. But also bear in mind that when you are describing what a location looks like, don't go into too much detail. Add in some detail so we have an idea. Don't include anything that isn't actually important. Another couple of things for action is we are not including camera directions. That is not for the screenwriter to decide. That is for the director and the cinematographer. You are not writing in any kind of backstory unless we are seeing or hearing it on screen. Another thing with action lines is keeping it short. You don't want to be writing all these big complicated paragraphs like you would if you were writing a novel. With a screenplay, you want someone to be able to read the screenplay so that they can kind of imagine the pacing of the film itself, which means that if you have scenes that are quite action-packed and fast-paced, then that means you would write a lot of shorter sentences following each other. If it was a slower scene, then you might actually take a bit more time and explain some more of the details and go into it a bit further and really kind of draw it out so that they can fully experience what it is that you are imagining. The third thing is dialogue. There are two different parts of dialogue. So every time a piece of dialogue comes up, it'll start off centered and you're going to be saying the character's name. And the character's name will be in all caps. And then underneath their name, that is when the dialogue comes in. If you're using a screenwriting tool, then it's automatically going to space the dialogue properly. Dialogue never reaches the ends of the page. It's always formatted in the center. So when writing dialogue, you're not including anything like quotation marks or anything like that. Just the fact that it is in the center of the page tells us that it is dialogue. You don't need to write he said, she said. It's already there. We already understand that it's dialogue. If you are doing something like a voiceover, what I was talking about before, we can't really see what someone is thinking. But maybe, for example, you decide that we do hear what they're thinking through some kind of voiceover, or perhaps someone is narrating the story as well. Then you would write their name in all capitals, and you would just put right next to it V.O. And then this tells us that it is a voiceover. And then you just continue the dialogue as usual. Another thing you might do, so perhaps there's a scene where you have a character talking, but we're not actually seeing that character. So maybe they're just off in the next room and they're shouting and we can hear them. So for that one, it would be very similar. You would still write the character's name in all caps, and then next to it, you would write O.S. And that just tells us that they are off screen. And then you would write the dialogue as normal. So we are going to be going into dialogue a bit more in the next video, so I won't go into it too much just now. What we're trying to do with dialogue is find a balance between cinematic and realistic. You don't want it to be too realistic, really, because in real life, people talk. It's a mess. It doesn't always have a purpose. There's no overarching goal to get to. We're just, we're fine. I want to go eat my breakfast now. So it's really finding that balance between cinematic and realistic. Another one just to add on top is parentheticals. And this is something that you would use in between a character's name and their dialogue. And a parenthetical is just something that helps give an idea of how the thing is being said. If a character is whispering, then you would write the character's name in all caps. Then under that, in brackets, you would say whisper. And then you just put the dialogue as normal. If you are using a screenwriting tool, then it'll automatically have a parenthetical option for you. So you don't need to worry about putting in those brackets. Parenthetical is often just short. It's just one or two words. This is where you could sometimes incorporate a bit of emotion. So maybe someone is talking and it has a bit of like a jittery, like paranoid sort of thing to it, in which case you can probably put something describing that kind of feeling. Or like, I wouldn't necessarily write angry, because there should be other identifiers telling us that they are angry, like in the action, or what the character is doing, or perhaps just in putting exclamation marks because they're loud, but being angry doesn't mean that you're loud, so it just needs to be shown somewhere else. But yeah, I don't think you would put angry in parentheticals though. There are a few other special circumstances that you would need to be aware of when doing a screenplay. You would have montages, you would have phone calls, how do you write it between two characters in different locations on the phone with each other? There would be things like if people are like texting each other, how do you include that in a script? Then you would have stuff like flashbacks and dreams. So essentially, if you're doing a montage, and there are a number of different ways that you can do this, but if you're doing a montage, you would basically just say montage, and then you would put out kind of in dot points, in very quick sentences of what would be happening in each scene of that montage. If you were doing a phone call, there are a number of ways you can do this, and sometimes it can depend on what is actually happening in the phone call. So if it's a particularly long phone call, I would establish the scene for one of the characters and maybe include their first bit of dialogue. And then I would include the second person's scene, the scene heading, a bit of action to describe where they are, and then maybe their first bit of dialogue. And then after that, I would put in just one extra heading that just says intercut between these two scenes. You don't need to keep putting in a new heading for every different bit of dialogue. You just include each character's bit of dialogue, and we would understand that it's cutting back and forth between each of them on the phone. Text messages would have a sort of a similar thing to it. People are sending text messages. It depends on how it gets filmed. But if you're just sort of staying on one character as you're just seeing all the text messages, perhaps, you would explain that this person is holding their phone, and then you would say in all caps, text messages, and then you would just describe what is happening in the text message. And this would be more of an action rather than in dialogue, but that one's probably up to you. It's really just as long as people get the idea that this is being said in a text. Flashbacks and dreams would happen in a similar way to how you would format a montage, whereas you would say flashback, and then under that you would basically just go through the flashback scene as it normally would be, and then at the end of the flashback you would just say back to present. Maybe you're doing a scene where you don't even really want people to know that it is a flashback if you're trying to mess with their heads, in which case I think you would just write it like normal, and you might just put in a few hints that it's different, like someone's hair is longer or something. Now we're just going to go through a few do's and don'ts when it comes to screenplay formatting. So in terms of font, we are using standard Courier 12 point with correct margins, and the software auto sets this, like I said. You do want to keep formatting simple and clean. You don't want bold, underline, or to change fonts. You don't want to write camera directions or things that can't be filmed. You do want to break up action lines and keep things snappy. And you don't want to over-label every moment. You want to trust clarity, and you need to understand that the screenplay is the skeleton of the film, and the director and the cinematographer and the rest of the crew, they are the ones who are going to figure out the rest of those details and really put some meat on those bones. Just a little bit of recap and your homework for today. All you need to do today is find some kind of screenwriting tool. And again, you can go for that free trial option for Final Draft because that will cover you for more than enough days for this particular course. And then I just want you to go through and I want you to play with it. I want you to make some scene headings. I want you to go through your outline, grab a couple of those scenes and try it out. Put the scene heading in, put the actions in, write a little bit of character dialogue, try some parentheticals. Just do whatever kind of feels natural. And then if you can do a bit of that today, then once again, you're already ahead, because tomorrow we are going to be learning a bit more about dialogue. And then the next day is when we finally start writing the rough draft of your screenplay. Your homework for today is to write out 1 page of script from your outline. And this needs to be properly formatted. That is the end of this video. Tomorrow we are going to learn more about writing dialogue. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.